ladies and gentlemen, Mughals and Ronsos, this is the definitive, unconditional, and objective truth about the ever-subjective topic that is the top 10 Final Fantasy games. And I better not see any complaints or about my decisions in the comment section.
Surrender and die!
Excuse me, sir. Don't you mean surrender or die?
A couple of rules before I start. Mainline entry games only.
Bullshit.
No MMOs. Final Fantasy 2, 3, and 5 are out because I haven't finished those. Now let's go. Number 10. Final Fantasy 15. Where do I even start with this one? I was really hyped for this game back when it was shown as Versus 13. But when plans changed to be made as the next mainline entry game, I think something drastically changed with its overall tone. This game shifted to a much more action style game that, to me, as a longtime fan of the turn-based combat system, it just didn't really land. I really do believe that the choice of combat system also heavily impacted the way that the story and the exploration of this game were delivered. The story in this game just doesn't really feel like it's about a bunch of weirdos fighting for a common cause. It became more about this main character with some companions attached to him fighting for that common cause, and that is a big difference. This game feels to me like a sort of lone wolf game, with Noctis at the realm. It's not really about a group of people anymore. Characters like Noctis and Clive from Final Fantasy 16 don't really use the power of friendship anymore to fight against the bigger evil, and that kinda sucks. The open world approach made this game feel very boring, dull, and generic than ever. I think there was a complete lack of interesting cities, NPCs, or honestly just interactivity with the environment. I would even argue that the approach of Final Fantasy XII linear world design made it feel a lot bigger in terms of actual size than the open world of Final Fantasy 15. Final Fantasy 15 does have a really good ending, and a really cool movie that showcases some of the events that should have belonged to the introduction of this game. But at the end of the day, it's a broken experience with a lot of potential, and who knows, maybe one day we will be able to see the true vision of Versus 13. Probably not. Number 9, Final Fantasy 13, the last turn-based Final Fantasy game. The curious thing is that 13 does have some great stuff going for it. An interesting approach to combat, some beautiful environments, and an impeccable soundtrack. But its combat system progression only really opens up at the end of the game. The Crystallium system, which is similar to the Sphere Grid system of Final Fantasy X, is very linear with barely any real input from the player on what he wants these characters' builds to be like. I do think that the reason why this system is so linear is because of how tied the game design is when it comes to the story that it wants to deliver. For the most part, you can ever choose which characters you want to fight with for the vast majority of the story, since the progression of the story is always trying to make it so you only have 2 or 3 characters in your party. I'm not entirely sure why they went with this route, but this severely hurt this game's combat and also some of the plots and twists of the story that I just personally think they make no sense and are clearly made for the sake of game design choices. Characters are honestly very flat. It does have an interesting world building, but it is delivered very poorly, and that's why for the most part the world feels very convoluted and hard to follow. It wants you to go and read the encyclopedia of the game if you want to understand all of these terms that are constantly thrown at you, instead of finding a way to explain it like Final Fantasy X did. More on that later. It's a game that does have some interesting ideas, but it's very poorly implemented in what's considered a corridor game with repetitive combat and barely any NPCs and cities to visit. Number 8, Final Fantasy VIII. For many, this is the underdog. Final Fantasy VIII was a bold game that released right after the bombastic success of Final Fantasy VII, and it changed the formula quite a lot. One of its biggest controversial changes was the junction system. Love it or hate it, Final Fantasy VIII tried to bring some flavor to the turn-based combat formula, and the junction system is a cool, unique idea. I think the issue is just that it becomes rather dull and boring to have to collect all of the magic in a repetitive cycle of combats. Apart from that, Final Fantasy VIII has a rather weak beginning with an amazing cutscene, may I say, but it's a cinematic where you basically have 2 students training against each other, and it's like this epic battle, life and death, and it's just, does it make sense? I don't think so. But if you push through that beginning, I do think Final Fantasy VIII has a very unique story, one that has some sci-fi sort of elements, without getting too much into spoilers, that you may or may not enjoy. I do feel like like it's a very odd Final Fantasy game, especially with its high school setting, that to me, it just doesn't really fit into the overall idea of a Final Fantasy game. But it does have one of the best villains in the franchise, one of the best mini games, may I add, amazing pre-rendered backgrounds with some really unique locations, superb soundtrack by Nobuo Uematsu, and a very unique story direction. Number 7. Final Fantasy 1. I put the OG in the 7th place out of pure respect. It's a fairly simple game for today's standards, but this is where it all began. This is where Nobuo Uematsu started to do some of his most memorable work. This is where a lot of the original ideas started and evolved over time, and where the original character and concept artist Yoshitaka Hamano helped to develop the overall identity and aesthetic of Final Fantasy. That's to take off the fact that it's incredibly grindy and some of those dungeons, woo-wee! But you know, it's worth. Number 6. Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII is a special game of the franchise. It's the game that completely redefined it by making it to the mainstream. It has one of the most memorable moments in gaming history, and it spawned a generation of developers who wanted to tell their own stories because they got inspired by Final Fantasy VII. I absolutely have respect for this game. I adore the materia system. It has an awesome cast of fun and quirky members that balance out how some serious characters like Cloud are. Sephiroth, Cloud, and Zack's overall story is really compelling. The pacing is non-stop. Something is constantly happening in the story. And I can't stress this enough about this era of pre-rendered backgrounds and how absolutely gorgeous some of these are. Pre-rendered backgrounds are basically just one shot that is pre-rendered, right? And the fact that it's only one shot, it gives time to developers to really refine these images and treat them as cinematic shots. But I do think that my experience with the OG Final Fantasy VII was unfortunately tainted. I played it really late. I already knew some of the major twists and story beats. You know, the characters' overall look really did not age very well. And I do want to say, if you plan on playing the OG Final Fantasy VII, I would really recommend you some mods to improve at the very least this part of the game. Number 5. Final Fantasy VI. Look, there's no deep reason why Final Fantasy VI is only number 5. It's just where it landed for me personally. This game is clearly a product of years of iteration across 5 previous entries, culminating in this masterpiece. Terra is one of my favorite characters across all of these games, and it does feel to me at least that the story of Terra really inspired later heroines like Aerith and Yuna. The world changes halfway through is probably one of the most memorable moments in the series. Kafka is a douchebag, and the soundtrack is phenomenal, with the opera house scene with Celes being one of the highlights. I do struggle with one thing with this game. There's no clear main protagonist, no one character that the player can identify with. I understand that this is intentional, but I personally prefer to have at least one character that lets me know that this is the main character. This is the character that you should be following somewhat to a bare minimum in the story. Octopath Traveler feels very similar to Final Fantasy VI in this regard, and that's one of the critiques that I also have of that game. I don't know why, but it just makes me detach, generally speaking, from the overall cast of characters. You know, maybe that's just me. Number 4. Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XII was the second game of the Final Fantasy franchise that I played as a kid, and I remember being mesmerized by how huge the world felt. I do have to admit that I rage quit back then. I really hated the combat system. Years later, I did revisit it and finished it. Does it deserve the 4th place ahead of Final Fantasy VI and VII? Probably not. This game has some major issues. The story completely falls flat in the last third, topped off by an even duller ending. The combat system is interesting. It blends both action and strategic elements, but at some point it becomes extremely automated, with barely any input from the player on a lot of these battles. But man, that first half of the game is so good. There's such a strong lineup of characters like Balthier, Ash, and Bosch, who, let's be honest, are the real main characters of this game. You explore some of the best cities in the franchise, full of movement and life, and I really dig the license system that lets you buy the right to use spells, upgrades, armors, or weapons and build your characters accordingly. The level design is top-notch, making you feel like part of a massive world that actually is pretty linear and very small once you actually take a look at it. This game honestly shows shows you how good the level design devs really were. The character design and texture work are superbly well done, all textured by hand with incredible detail for the PlayStation 2 era, and those hair physics? Insane. At the end of the day, Final Fantasy XII is a flawed game. Combat feels too automated, and the story kind of fizzles out in the end. But it made me genuinely feel like I was a part of a bigger world, with some truly great story, voice acting, and narrative moments. Number 3, Final Fantasy IV. Look, let me explain. I have a soft spot for Final Fantasy IV. It was my first 2D Final Fantasy game. It's a game that is very nostalgic to me, especially on the PlayStation Portable era, where I carried my PSP everywhere, playing a ton of games via emulator, totally not pirated. I have no idea what you're talking about. I do think that Final Fantasy VI objectively is a much better game all around, but I just adore it, the simplicity and quirkiness of 4. The combat has a ton of different strategies, magic, abilities, summons at your disposal, even though the customization was pretty limited, I have to say. But the story pacing is really nice, with the obvious highlight being Cecile transformation mid-game, which completely took me by surprise the first time I saw it. It's a short, accessible, and enjoyable game for anyone who wants a glimpse of that 2D era of Final Fantasy games. It also introduced a bunch of really important things about the Final Fantasy franchise. The Dragoon class, summons, a story that actually revolves around its characters. If there's a single game that cemented the type of storytelling and staples that Final Fantasy is still known for this day, I would argue it's Final Fantasy IV. Number 2, Final Fantasy IX. I only played this game as an adult, and by this time I already had experienced a bunch of Final Fantasy games. And to be honest, I had no expectations when jumping into Final Fantasy IX, and my god was I blown away. I consider Final Fantasy IX to be the Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood of the Final Fantasy franchise. It does everything well at a high level. The story can be fun but carry out some serious moments, delivered in a theatrical way that it almost feels like we're watching a play unfold. Kouto is by far one of my favorite villains, having this massive fear for his own mortality, hence being the main reason why he does the thing he does in the game. And then you have Vivi and Zidane's entire arc of searching their own identity. I love main characters like Zidane. Characters that just ooze life, who love living and deeply value the people around them. That's probably why I also love Titus. They're the same kind of character. They are the Luffys, the Gokus, and Narutos of the JRPG worlds. There's a reason why they work, right? There's something about this group of weirdos that just works so well and captures the spirit of Final Fantasy like no other. It's actually a shame that newer games have moved away from including at the very least one party member that is not human. Final Fantasy IX is a love letter to the original Final Fantasy games, a love letter to JRPGs with peak pre-rendered backgrounds, but please get me the hell out of this minigame. And finally, the undisputed 110% consensual among all Final Fantasy fans. The top Final Fantasy game is Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X is a game that deeply influenced how I view the world and video games as a medium. It tackles the role of machines and innovation against human spirituality. It has very complex world building, but it's delivered in a digestible way through the eyes of its main character Titus, the outsider who doesn't understand anything and is trying to make sense out of the world he's been thrown into. It has one of the best endings ever in video game history, just to be completely destroyed by its sequel, Final Fantasy X-2, but it just doesn't exist, right? The Sphere Grid is an amazing progression system that lets you pick and choose the paths that you want for all your party members. Characters like Auron, Yuna, Seymour are instantly memorable, and it has a completely fun yet absolutely broken minigame called Blitzball. And my god, have I played it way too much. It also has some of the worst yet most charming voice actings that I've ever heard, which we do kind of forget in the context of being the first Final Fantasy game with voice acting. But on top of that, it has amazing cinematics that aren't just visually stunning, but carry real narrative weight. Final Fantasy X is one of those games that made me go out of my way to understand what's behind the curtain of video game development, why developers made the choices that they did, why there's so much focus on things like religion, topography, language, singing, game design, characters, everything. It's not a perfect game, no game is. but it's a perfect example of a game that understands the story of humanity and our desire for unity in a world filled with chaos. This is it. This is the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed this unconditional, completely objective truth about a very subjective topic, that is the top 10 Final Fantasy games. And if there is any sort of top 10 that you want me to talk about and deliver an unconditional truth, let me know for the love of God in the comments. But yeah, that's it for me, folks. Over and out.
Like and subscribe.